We have the next paper is by Mário Correia. He's from the University of Porto, and he is doing a presentation about an author. It's called Gomes de Lisboa, and he has done an edition and with its Portuguese translation. And we have this new book by Mário Correia. So, congratulations.
Mario is here signing autographs.
Yeah.
Drop by,
Stop,
sign
please.
copies. We'll be very happy.
And well, he's speaking about these authors. So the title of his paper is "Experience and Natural Philosophy in Italian Renaissance Scholasticism, Gomes of Lisbon's Scotistic Response to Nicoletto Vernia."
Yeah.
So you can start.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much, Nicola and Katia, for accepting me here. It's very nice to be here. I learned a lot in these 2 days of conferences. Thank you to everyone, and I'm going to start to present my communication. In the slides, it will just appear the text I'm commenting, and I'm sorry about my English translations, but I think they are enough to understand what I want to say. Nicoletto Vernia was the most reputed professor of natural philosophy of the second half of the 15th century. Disciple of Paulo della Pergola in Venice and of the Averroist Aristotelian Gaetano of Thiene at the University of Padua, Nicoletto was educated in the movement of renewal of Aristotelianism through new readings of Averroes and also of the ancient commentators such as Themistius or Alexander of Aphrodisias. In his works, we can see the struggles of his time, such as the tension between the calculatores mathematical approach to physical problems and the search for a renewed Aristotelian method clean from the distortions of medieval Latin commentators. Vernia wrote about the most polemical topics of his time. 1. The question whether heavy and light bodies are moved because of something external to them or by some intrinsic force. 2. The problem of method in natural philosophy, namely, what is its subject and how to create good demonstrations by accommodating correctly demonstration quia and demonstration propter quid. 3. The dispute of the arts, in other words, the dispute over the hierarchization of the nobility of sciences. And 4. The Averroistic thesis of the unity of the intellect. This last subject was polemical, and Vernia had to retreat from his Averroistic approach because Pietro Barozzi, Bishop of Padua, condemned him in 1489. In this communication, I am going to focus only on the problem of method in natural philosophy, and I will focus on it from the point of view of Gomes of Lisbon's critique to Nicoletto Vernia. Gomes of Lisbon, a Portuguese Franciscan Scotist, wrote Quaestio per utilis de cuiuscumque scientia subjecto principali tertamen naturalis philosophiae, published somewhere between 1485 and 1492 in Pavia, as a direct response to Vernia's critiques to Scotus. Here are the text of Vernia. Quaestio anens mobilis sit totius naturalis philosophiae subjectum. The comparison between the 2 authors will be guided by 2 interconnected problems. First, the subject matter of physics. Second, the role of experience in the process of knowledge. As we will see, the answer to the first problem is essentially determined by the second problem. Before we get there, I will show some previous aspects of other Gomes of Lisbon's work, Scriptum super questiones metaphysicae Antoni André. where the very own choice of the questions of Antonius Andreas, he comments, are a symptom of his theoretical preoccupation with the relation between experience, demonstration, and scientific knowledge. So first I will talk about the Gomes of Lisbon's account of the relation between experience and knowledge through the relation he makes between quia and propter quid demonstrations. Gomes of Lisbon taught philosophy and also theology at the University of Padua from 1482 to 1511, before being designated general vicar of the Friars Minor and moving to Rome, where he died 2 years later. Together with Antonio Trombetta, he was one of the most important Scotists of his time in Italy. His biggest works are unfortunately lost, namely Questiones quod libetalis in via Scoti and Lecturae super quator libros sententiarum. However, modern readers can access not only his Quaestio against Nicoletto Vernia, but also the reportation of some of his classes on Antonio Andreas, the work I already talked about, and a question about mutualist banks created by Franciscans, the Mons Pietatis, and also several letters that were used as a preface of other works. Also, it is very interesting to see that he is the main character of a dialogue by Paolo Ricci, a Kabbalist that converted to Christianity, and is the main character trying to convince three Jews about the Christian truth. Before getting to the question against Nicoletto Vernia, there are some previous informations that might be useful to understand his critiques to the Paduan Averroist. Firstly, it is useful to present the texts of Aristotle that constitute the common ground of the discussion, mostly two of them. The first text, whose interpretations created different perspectives about scientific method, is of course the beginning of physics. So I'll read it. Maybe I think everyone in this room knows this text, but I'll read it the same to make some points about it. The natural way of doing this, that is, to determine what relates to the principles of natural philosophy, is to start from the things which are more knowable and clear to us and proceed towards those which are clear and more knowable by nature. For the same things are not knowable relatively to us and knowable without qualification. So we must follow this method and advance from what is more obscure by nature but clearer to us towards what is more clear and more knowable by nature. Now, what is to us plain and clear at first is rather confused masses, the elements and principles of which become known to us later by analysis. But we must advance from universals to particulars, for it is a whole that is more knowable to sense perception, and the universal is a kind of whole, comprehending many things within it like parts. Much the same thing happens in the relation of the name to the formula, maybe definition, of the name to the definition. A name, for example, circle, means vaguely a sort of whole. Its definition analyzes this into particulars. This apparently simple text generates several problems to the interpreter. How to relate the conceptual pairs that are presented? Is it the same process to depart from the more knowable to us in direction to the more knowable by nature, and to depart from universals to particulars, or from the confused masses to the elements, or from the names that mean vaguely a whole to the definition? Nicoletto Vernia will consider that the subject matter of physics must be mobile body, corpus mobile, rather than natural substance, substantia naturalis, because bodies in movement are what is more known to us, and so a science must depart from it. Gomes of Lisbon, on the contrary, will say that we must understand that science by nature is not influenced by the ways we can acquire it. Hence, it is irrelevant if movement is more known to us, because that doesn't change the primacy of nature over movement. As we will see, the only criterion to define the subject matter of a science will be virtual inclusion, continentia virtualis. That is, the subject matter of a science is the one that includes primarily in itself the truths of that science, because conclusions are virtually in the principles, and the principles are virtually in a subject. It must be explained later the meaning of virtual, and also what determines the primacy of a subject relatively to the other things it includes. The other text of Aristotle that is obviously at stake is posterior analytics, especially two parts that concern quia and propter quid demonstration. In the book 1, chapter 13, where Aristotle gives the example of knowing that the planets are near through their not twinkling, and the book 2, chapter 1, where Aristotle says that we seek four things, namely the fact, quia, the reason why, propter quid, if it is, si est, and what it is, quid est. And then he gives the example of a lunar eclipse. The discussion about how can demonstrations quia and propter quid work together in order to generate knowledge, as already mentioned, was one of the problems that were exhaustively discussed in the 15th century. Both Vernia and Gomes are very interested in Aristotle's example of the planets and also of the lunar eclipse. Vernia treats it, at least indirectly, in his unpublished exposition on the first book of Posterior Analytics, Expositio in Posteriorum Librum Priorem, in a question called Quaestio de Regresso. Nicoletto's theory of the regressus demonstrativus is based on Averrois's approach to demonstratio potissima, two convertible syllogisms in which the middle term is the cause of the major term in the first syllogism, and this major term becomes the middle term in the second syllogism. Nicoletto's regressus works as follows. Firstly, one acquires some unconfirmed universal knowledge by induction, that is, from the senses, memories, and experiments, ex sensibus memoris et experimentis. Then there is what he calls a negotiatio intellectus, or in other words, the formulation of a cause that would be prior to this universal knowledge. Finally, by demonstration propter quid, one can verify if this hypothesis is confirmed by the observation of its effects. If the effects are observed, since they are deduced from a cause, this cause is now confirmed universal knowledge. Empirical observation, as we can see, is useful both at the beginning and in the end of the regressus. At the beginning, it is responsible for the acquisition of a confused universal knowledge. In the end, it confirms or denies the hypothesized cause. Between these two moments, negotiatio intellectus tries to put aside the special features of singulars in order to formulate the cause behind the confused empirical knowledge. Gomes of Lisbon proposes a different approach. In his Quaestio per Utilis, he comments explicitly the Aristotelian example of the lunar eclipse, as we will see. Also in his Scriptum super Questiones Metaphysicae Antoni André, the Portuguese Franciscan deals in several questions with quia and propter quid demonstrations, and also with the role of experience. Gomes of Lisbon wants to insist that the way we get to some knowledge by learning is not the same as the way demonstration in itself works. It is very interesting to notice that he both comments on questions that deal with the relation between experience and knowledge, and talks about this topic indirectly in other questions. From the 14 questions of Andreas, he comments, for the sake of brevity, I would like to stand out just the ones that directly deal with this relation. Yeah, it's that. In the first question, whether art is generated by experiences, queritur utrum ex experimentis generatur ars, Gomes, as Andreas, affirms that there cannot exist any incomplex cognition of terms and principles without sensitive knowledge, This is a basic Aristotelian assumption. However, he disagrees when Andreas says that sensitive knowledge is not necessarily simpliciter in an absolute sense. He disagrees with Andreas in this point. More important than this is his note on how knowledge is generated from experiences, followed by the conversion of this knowledge in a propter quid demonstration, which is exactly the example that Therese gave yesterday of posterior analytics 220, and also that José Higuera talked about Buridanos, about rhubarb and the cholera. Gomes of Lisbon uses the same example to show how can we come from this quia knowledge, from the effects that we observe in the patients, to a general scientific proposition. Here is the text. I'm going to read it. Note, in this way, art is generated from experiences, because there's no need to have the experience of all the singulars, but of some, as of some circumstances. For example, I know that given this medicine, namely rhubarb, to Socrates ill with cholera, he would be relieved, and similarly Plato. And I see that rhubarb always produces that effect independently of the variations in accidents, as in Socrates and others. I argue that this happens from such medicinal form, namely that effect and that in which it naturally acts. And so, it cannot act nor produce any effect in other way. Therefore, from these experiences and memories, I form a universal proposition which says every rhubarb is a purgative of cholera. And therefore, from that experiences, a demonstrative knowledge quia is made, also a posteriori. Afterwards, knowing this and having the cognition quia of this art, and knowing this art by demonstration quia, the intellect investigates, for example, the cause of that effect, and then it has properly an art propter quid, such as every mixture of that sort, having a form of that sort, produces cholera. Rhubarb is of that sort, hence, etc. And thus, in this way, art is generated from experiences. This doesn't mean that the experiences are the cause of the art, but they are occasional or instrumental things for the cognition of the art. Gomes' account of the role of experience in the process of knowledge is complemented by the next question, whether the expertus that has ars operates with more certainty than the non-experienced artifacts. Sorry. Where in this question he distinguishes two different meanings of ars. The first meaning is taken from the book 6 of Ethics, where Aristotle divides the practical knowledge in prudence about actions and art about things that are produced, factibilia, and Gomes calls it ars mechanica. And in this sense, the artifacts is the same as the expertus. In the second meaning, it means more generally knowledge or science, scientia. And in this sense, the artifacts is what he calls an inventor. The inventor is the one that has propter quid knowledge, identified with a priori knowledge. Finally, there is one particular aspect of the third question, whether the most universal things are harder to cognize, that is interesting in what concerns the relation between experience and knowledge. Gomes argues that what makes the metaphysician the wiser scientist is the fact that he knows all the things in their proper quiddity or nature, and not the fact that he treats the most abstract objects. This is noteworthy for two reasons. First, because he thinks that the hardest knowledge to acquire is the knowledge of the most specific species in their proper nature. Second, because it will be very important to him that natural philosophy doesn't know a thing in its proper nature or essence, but somehow contracted on a ratio formalis or formalitas or realitas, which, although pertains to its nature, doesn't define it properly, such as laughter in humans. Having this information in mind, we are ready to understand Gomes of Lisbon's critique to Nicoletto Vernia. This is the second part, smaller part of my communication. Quaestio anens mobile sit totius naturalis philosophiae subjectum of Nicoletto Vernia has 3 articles. The presentation of deviant positions, the first article. Then the second is the exposition of Aristotle and Averrois. And the third is the answer to the deviant positions. In the first article, one of the several deviant positions Nicoletto criticizes is the one held by the 14th century Scotists Antonius Andreas and John Canonicus. Vernia says that they postulate a material and a formal element in a subject, namely the substrate and the formal reason of the substrate. In the case of natural philosophy, if we want to consider that it has its own proper truths, the subject matter cannot be the Thomist ens mobile, since the treatment of nature as being, as ends, only gives us a confused knowledge, not a proper knowledge of it. Also, it would mean that natural philosophy has a relation of subordination with metaphysics, which goes against Aristotle's doctrine of the 3 primary sciences. John Canonicus says that the subject matter must be finite natural substance, substantia finita naturalis, and Anthony Andreas says that it is substance naturally assumed as natural, substantia naturaliter in quantum naturalis. Nicoletto will argue that nature is not an absolute noun and only means that which is principle of movement, but a subject which is principle of movement is mobile body. In what concerns the relation between experience and knowledge, Vernia's argument against Scotus continentia virtualis are symptomatic. This is how he presents Scotus' doctrine. About the primary subject, Scotus says, in the first of the sentences, question about the subject, that the reason of all the primary subjects is to contain virtually and primarily all the truths of their habit. I prove it this way. The primary object contains immediate propositions because the subject of the primary propositions contains the predicate, and so the evidence of the whole proposition. However, immediate propositions contain conclusions. Hence, the subject of the immediate propositions contains formally in itself all the truths of its habit. Vernia has 2 arguments against virtual inclusion. First, the subject of the immediate propositions doesn't contain the predicate, because the predicate is the definition of the subject. It is the predicate that contains the subject. This means that the subject contains truths in virtue of principles and not conversely. Second, in the order of esse cognitum of cognition, the most common concept doesn't lead the intellect to a distinct cognition unless it is limited by some proper principles. So, this concept cannot give itself its proper principles. The general claim is that we cannot start making science from what we don't know. The subject must be posterior to principles in order for them to be contained on it. He proposes 8 conditions for the subject matter of a science. It must be a real being, or at least have foundation in a real being. It must be one with unity of analogy. It must be universal. It must be adequate. It must be primarily known in what concerns its formal and proper reasons. It must have subjective parts. It must have affections proven from it, and it must have principles. Vernia proposes that mobile body fulfills the 8 conditions. Gomes, however, will prove that some of these conditions are false or badly interpreted, and that the true ones are superfluous and presupposed by virtual inclusion. His strategy, in the first article of the Quaestio per Utilis, is to present that the proper and formal reason of the subject of a science is virtual inclusion. From that, he makes two deductions. One of them is that the subject contains affections not only in the order of being, in entitate, but also in the order of cognition, in cognosci. The other is that it is impossible for a subject to contain all the truths of a science from its proper reason, because all the sciences treat several quiddities that are different in genus and species, but it is possible for a subject to have what he calls primacy of community and predication. It is between the first and the second deduction that Gomes discards one by one the 8 conditions of Vernia. Here are this is a summary of his argument. I'm only focusing now on the 5th one, is the most important for him, being primarily known, being primo notum. Gomes argues against Vernia's critique to Scotus, particularly that in the order of cognition, the most common concept doesn't lead the intellect to a distinct cognition. He tries to show how the intellect gets to know immediate truths, and then some mediate truths taken from the immediate. There are 3 kinds of truths that the intellect can take from getting in touch with essences or quiddities. Here is the text he talks about this. I'm going to summarize it. First, the immediate knowledge of the definition taken from the definitum, from the defined. Second, the immediate knowledge of the passions or affections of the definition. Third, the immediate knowledge of the affections of the definitum. To give an example, when I think of a human being, a definitum, I have the immediate knowledge of humans being definition, namely rational animal. Then I have the immediate knowledge of the effects or affections of animality, such as having sensations, having movement by itself, etc. And also of the affections of rationality, namely having a rational soul. Finally, there are some other things I can know about human beings, like that they are capable of laughing. However, this knowledge is not immediate, because it is not taken directly from human beings' definition, but is like an effect of it. This third kind of truths correspond to the Porphyrian notion of proprium. Also, it is important to know that the subject matter of a science is the one whose proper truths, or of these 3 kinds, are common truths of any inferior subject treated in the science in which it is the subject. This is what Gomes of Lisbon calls primacy of community and predication, primitas communitatis et praedicationis. This is also what explains the use of the word virtual. There is no subject that gives us all the knowledge about everything that depends on it just because we know it. However, the subject of a primary science must be the one that has primacy of community and predication, which means the one whose truths are common truths required to know everything else. Part of the second and the whole third article treats exactly the problem of establishing what he calls the multiplication of knowledge, both in genus and species, and the subalternation of sciences also. In other words, what are primary subjects of all knowledge, and how they maintain their unity, descending to truths dependent on theirs. One of the primary subjects will be, of course, the subject of natural philosophy, whose truths are totally independent from the subjects of metaphysics and mathematics, and, of course, theology also. After proving that we acquire immediate truths from the quiddities we get in touch by experience, the only thing Gomes needs to do is to show that movement is contained in the quiddity of nature, or is an effect of nature, and that our intellect can access to some immediate truths about nature after getting in touch with its effects by demonstration quia. If the intellect gets access to the quiddity of nature, there's no need for experience anymore. Oh. Since now knowledge is acquired by demonstration, propter, quid, or a priori. That's exactly the reasoning of the second article of the Quaestio per Utilis. The first conclusion of the article is that movement cannot be the subject of anything, since it is a property in the Porphyrian sense of proprium of natural substance. There could be natural substances that wouldn't move, that wouldn't change their definition. However, all of them move, so it's something like an effect of the definition. Hence, it is it is not because some substances move that they are natural, but on the contrary, they move because they are natural. So natural substance must be the subject matter of natural philosophy. As there is nothing above nature that proves it, it cannot be proved, but presupposed. And not only the si est, the if it is presupposed, but also the quid est, immediately known through the definition of nature. This immediate knowledge about nature gives us the principles of natural philosophy. Sorry. Where? Sorry. Just to finish, I will present the text where he talks about the Aristotelian example of the lunar eclipse. And if the eclipse of the moon is per se known by the senses quia, however, it is not per se known according to nature, as it has a per se cause. As it has a per se cause, it is not ridiculous to demonstrate. On the contrary, after being known by experience that truth, namely the eclipse of the moon, and because the per se cause is discovered by inquiry, dividing and composing, then the truth is known in the first grade of cognition and certainty, propter quid, by its per se cause. For Gomes of Lisbon, creating knowledge is based on dividing and composing. First, by experience, we get a confused whole of something confused or composed. Gomes would call it a quid nominis concept. Then we divide it in its parts until we get to something simple, that cannot be divided anymore. When we get there, the simplicity of this object makes us have distinct immediate knowledge of it. Then we are ready to go down again, but now with propter quid demonstrations. And when we get to the point where we have started, now the concept is not a quid nominis concept, but a quid rei concept. This process could make us think that the most common concept of all, being as being, would be the subject of all the sciences, because the primary truths of being are applied to everything. But of course no. There are still three primary speculative natural sciences. Primary sciences are the ones where the substract makes a perfect unity with the formal reason. Being as being in metaphysics, nature as nature in physics, quantity as quantity in mathematics. I hope that this paper makes a little contribution to the understanding of one little piece of a big puzzle of authors and discussions that led to modern natural philosophy. And I also hope that scholars pay more attention to the fascinating work of Gomes of Lisbon in the future. Thank you.